I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
The order came without ceremony, but its meaning was explosive. Prince William had learned enough to believe that Queen Elizabeth II's private jewelry collection could no longer remain accessible under ordinary palace arrangements. Within hours, access was restricted, keys were accounted for, and the collection was effectively frozen. But William had not acted because of rumor or family rivalry. He acted because Princess Anne had discovered something that changed the meaning of the jewels, and threatened to expose a far deeper royal conflict. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William understood immediately that these were not simply expensive objects sitting behind locked doors. Elizabeth's collection carried memories, promises, family inheritance, and pieces connected to the crown itself. Crown-linked jewelry meant pieces associated with royal duty, rather than ordinary personal ownership, while other items had belonged privately to the late monarch and carried deeply personal meaning. Some had been gifts, others had moved through generations. Every classification mattered, because one changed description could alter who controlled a piece, who could wear it, and where it might eventually go. Anne entered the private meeting already furious. She placed an access list before William and explained that several pieces had been moved, reclassified. The Princess Royal, the traditional title given to the monarch's eldest daughter, had spent decades close enough to her mother to recognize which possessions Elizabeth treated differently. She was not defending diamonds, she was defending intent. William listened without interruption, until Anne pointed to one handwritten annotation. He read it once, then again. His expression tightened. "Say that part again," he asked. Anne repeated what she had found through a documented inventory review. One historically significant piece now appeared under a designation she believed Elizabeth would never have approved. That single discrepancy changed the atmosphere completely. William stopped treating the matter as administrative confusion. He ordered the relevant cabinets, private cases, inventories, and access records placed under restricted control until every item could be checked against the late Queen's known arrangements. Restricted access meant that nobody could remove, reassign, or authorize use of the collection without specific permission. The future king laid the list flat and quietly made the order absolute. Anne did not relax. Her anger only deepened, because another pattern had emerged. The same name appeared repeatedly beside questionable movements involving more than one piece. William looked at her, waiting. She hesitated, because saying it aloud would transform a dispute over jewelry into a confrontation inside the family itself. Then she told him who it was. The collection was finally protected from movement, but William could do nothing to protect the monarchy from the identity Anne had just revealed. For William, Anne, and King Charles, Elizabeth's jewels carried completely different memories. To one, they represented continuity. To another, they were fragments of a mother she had served with fierce loyalty. And to the king, they belonged to a reign whose shadow still stretched over his own. Now those memories had collided with a brutal practical question. Who had the right to decide what happened to Elizabeth's most personal possessions after she was gone? William felt the weight of that question more sharply than anyone expected. As heir, he understood royal continuity as more than succession from one sovereign to another. It was the duty of protecting symbols, traditions, and possessions whose meaning could outlive every person currently wearing a title. The heir is the person next in line to the throne. But for William, that position also carried responsibility. If a historically important jewel was moved carelessly now, its meaning could be permanently altered later. Anne understood the danger differently. She had watched her mother choose certain pieces for duty, and keep others close because of private memories. She knew the difference instinctively. Charles did not take the news calmly. When he learned that William had restricted access to the collection, irritation surfaced almost immediately. His son had acted on something tied directly to his late mother, and the king felt control slipping from his own hands. Yet Anne refused to soften what she had found. She placed 3 inventory entries before him and explained that each carried a destination or classification that troubled her. An inventory was simply the official record showing what was held, where it belonged, and how it was categorized. Charles removed his glasses, placed them beside the papers, and stared at his sister. Then he asked the question none of them wanted spoken aloud. Was she accusing someone inside the family? Anne did not retreat. She told Charles that embarrassment was no longer the issue. Elizabeth's intentions were. William watched the exchange carefully, because another problem had already emerged from the records. Access to certain private pieces had not depended on one individual. Several household permissions overlapped, meaning a jewel could potentially be moved, examined, or reclassified before anyone outside that narrow chain noticed. Household permissions were the internal authorizations, allowing trusted staff to handle royal possessions. That gap was small, but it was enough. Anne then delivered the detail that turned suspicion into something darker. Her documented review showed the same pattern across several pieces linked to Elizabeth's most private family history. This was no isolated error. William leaned forward and asked when it had begun. Anne hesitated, then named a particular royal gathering held before their mother's death. Charles looked from his sister to his son, suddenly understanding that the problem had started while Elizabeth was still alive. To understand why William had locked the collection, they would have to return to the night Anne first realized someone was already planning for those jewels before the Queen was gone. Months before William ordered the collection sealed, Anne witnessed a moment so small that nobody around her understood its importance. There was no shouting, no public scandal, no dramatic announcement. There was simply a private conversation after a family gathering, one jewelry case that should not have been there, and a question about Elizabeth's possessions asked far too early. Anne remembered the exchange because her mother was still alive, and because the answer given that night never stopped troubling her. Anne had spent decades watching Elizabeth handle jewelry with remarkable precision. Some pieces belonged to royal duty, some were family inheritances, and others carried memories so personal that their meaning went far beyond value. Royal duty pieces were jewels used for official appearances and state occasions, while private pieces belonged to the individual rather than automatically to the institution. The princess understood those boundaries because she had seen her mother enforce them quietly for years. That knowledge made the later conversation impossible to dismiss. The discomfort began after a private Windsor family dinner. Anne entered an adjoining room and heard Queen Camilla speaking with a senior household aide about what would happen to several of Elizabeth's personal jewels when the reign eventually changed. The question was direct. Would those pieces automatically pass into the new queen's use? A household aide was simply a trusted royal staff member responsible for sensitive practical matters inside the family's official residences. Camilla's words landed badly because Elizabeth was still alive, still reigning, and still personally connected to the objects being discussed. Anne stopped at the doorway. Camilla noticed her almost immediately and closed the jewelry reference case resting nearby. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Anne asked why her mother's private possessions were being discussed at all. The queen consort answered carefully, explaining that future ceremonial planning required certain questions to be considered in advance. But the princess heard something colder beneath the explanation. She saw photographs and catalog numbers inside the case before it shut, and several belonged to pieces she knew Elizabeth treated as deeply personal. Anne chose silence that night, but not because her concern disappeared. Challenging Camilla openly would have meant suggesting that someone close to the sovereign was already positioning herself around possessions Elizabeth had not surrendered. That accusation would have torn through the family while the monarch was still carrying out her duties. So Anne remembered the numbers instead. Months later, grief turned memory into evidence. After Elizabeth's death, Anne reviewed the documented inventory and found several of those same catalog numbers marked for altered custody. The coincidence was too exact. The old Windsor conversation suddenly had consequences. William listened to the full documented account without interrupting. When Anne finished, he understood why the lockdown could no longer remain only an administrative measure. That awkward exchange at Windsor had become the point of no return, and now the prince wanted Camilla to explain it herself. William did not summon a committee. He did not send an aide. He went directly to Camilla. By then, the collection had been restricted. Anne had given him the Windsor account, and several entries no longer looked accidental. What followed was not merely a dispute over jewelry. It was a confrontation over Elizabeth's memory, Camilla's place inside the monarchy, and whether a future king believed the current queen had crossed a boundary that should never have been approached. William entered the meeting, determined to control his anger. He wanted one answer before anything else. Who had authorized the disputed changes? The prince knew that an inventory reclassification, an official change in how a royal possession was recorded, controlled, or assigned, could look administrative while carrying enormous consequences. If Elizabeth's private pieces were quietly shifted into another category, future use could begin to look legitimate simply because the paperwork said so. Camilla understood the danger immediately. The moment he mentioned Windsor, she knew Anne had spoken. Camilla's expression hardened when William described the conversation his aunt had documented. She insisted that discussing future ceremonial use was not the same as claiming Elizabeth's possessions. Ceremonial use meant wearing a royal object for official duties without necessarily owning it personally. The Queen Consort argued that planning for a new reign required difficult conversations long before anyone wanted to have them. William did not accept that explanation easily. He told her that convenience, rank, and assumptions about what a queen might wear could never be allowed to rewrite his grandmother's intentions. Camilla rose from her chair when the prince pushed one disputed entry across the table. William stayed seated. Beside the catalog number for one of Elizabeth's deeply personal brooches was a notation suggesting it had been provisionally moved toward a group of pieces intended for Camilla's future appearances. Provisional movement meant the transfer had not yet become final, but it had progressed far enough to influence future planning. William asked her to explain it. She stared at the entry, furious and humiliated, then denied giving any direct order for the brooch to be transferred. Camilla's denial did not end the confrontation. Through her documented account of that private conversation, she admitted that the Windsor discussion had gone further than Anne originally heard. She had asked which jewels might remain active inside the monarchy after Elizabeth's reign, believing some could continue serving ceremonial purposes. The Queen Consort insisted that she had never instructed anyone to treat private property as hers. But William immediately saw the deeper problem. Someone had taken those conversations and converted them into actual administrative changes. William finally asked the question that shifted the entire crisis. Who had done it? Camilla gave him the name of a senior palace official connected to the post-accession transition. Then she added one devastating detail. The official had not been acting alone. According to the internal instructions she had seen, the authority came from higher up. William said nothing for several seconds. Camilla had denied taking Elizabeth's jewels, but her explanation had opened a far more dangerous possibility. Royal authority itself may have provided the cover, and the next person William would have to confront was much closer than he expected. The confrontation changed the question. William no longer needed to know only who wanted the jewels. He needed to know who possessed enough authority to change where they were recorded, stored, and eventually used. Inside the monarchy, ownership, custody, inheritance, and ceremonial access could overlap without meaning the same thing. That complexity had created the perfect hiding place for a decision nobody wanted to admit making. And now King Charles found himself standing at the center of it. William moved quickly, because every new record made the chain harder to ignore. Private ownership meant a jewel belonged personally to Elizabeth, while custodial control meant someone could physically safeguard or manage it without owning it. Ceremonial availability meant a piece could be approved for official use, and household authority referred to the practical power trusted staff had to organize those arrangements. The prince ordered every disputed item traced from Elizabeth's final acknowledged inventory through each later alteration. He wanted dates, signatures, instructions, sent every hand that had touched the process. Charles felt the pressure closing around him as the records arrived. The transition of reign had required hundreds of decisions, and many had passed through officials working under the new sovereign's authority. A post-accession directive was an instruction issued after a new monarch took the throne, often allowing household teams to reorganize practical matters for the new reign. The king had approved such measures to keep the institution functioning. He had never imagined that Elizabeth's most personal possessions might be swept into the same machinery. William confronted his father privately. He did not accuse him of taking anything, but his question cut deeper than an accusation. Had protecting institutional calm become more important than protecting Elizabeth's wishes? Charles stiffened. He reminded his son that a monarchy could not freeze every administrative process during succession. Yet the prince pushed back. Efficiency meant nothing if it allowed personal intent to disappear beneath paperwork. The argument was no longer about jewelry. It was about whether the system had moved faster than grief. Charles finally reached the authorization line. He read it once, then again, pressing his thumb against the page as if the wording might change beneath it. The directive gave household teams broad permission to reorganize royal assets for the new reign. His signature sat beneath it. The king fell silent before admitting the truth to William. The signature was his, but nobody had explained that Elizabeth's disputed private pieces were being included. William then asked for the one document that could settle everything. Where was Elizabeth's signed instruction approving those reclassifications? The search produced nothing, no signed authorization, no direct order, no clear evidence that she had wanted those pieces moved at all. Charles understood the danger immediately. His broad approval may have created cover for decisions he never intended, and now he had to decide whether to reverse them inside the household. The king had found his own signature at the beginning of the chain. What came next would reveal just how many relationships that signature had already damaged. The lockdown had started as a precaution. It now became a verdict. Access permissions were withdrawn, disputed classifications were suspended, and every proposed use of Elizabeth's jewels stopped immediately. For Camilla, the consequences were intensely personal. Whatever she believed the earlier conversations meant, William's decision made one reality unmistakable. Until the review ended, the late Queen's collection existed beyond her reach, and Anne had become the person whose warning changed everything. William formalized the restriction without leaving room for interpretation. No disputed jewel could be worn, transferred, loaned, reclassified, or reassigned until the review was complete. A formal freeze meant every item stayed exactly where it was, while ownership and intended use were examined. The prince knew why that mattered. Once a piece appeared at an official engagement, public use could create the impression that its status had already been settled. Charles supported the order, after discovering that his own administrative approval had been broader than he understood, giving his son's decision the authority of the reigning monarch. Camilla received the consequence almost immediately. A jewel that had been considered for an upcoming engagement was removed from planning, and the queen consort was informed through an internal household notice that no replacement from Elizabeth's disputed collection would be offered. She dismissed her dresser and remained alone for several moments. The dresser was the trusted staff member responsible for helping coordinate clothing and jewelry for royal appearances. Camilla looked toward the empty place where the piece had been expected to sit, then closed the case herself. She said nothing. Camilla's silence concealed something sharper than disappointment. She believed Anne had done more than challenge an administrative process. The princess had questioned her judgment, her boundaries, and, in the queen's mind, her legitimacy inside the family. That humiliation deepened because Charles had supported the freeze. The king had not accused his wife of wrongdoing, but his approval told her that preserving Elizabeth's intentions now came before defending her from embarrassment. William had turned a private disagreement into a rule nobody could ignore. Anne, meanwhile, found another disturbing entry in the documented review. One especially personal piece associated with Elizabeth had nearly been separated from the private family grouping altogether. That grouping meant items treated as family possessions rather than objects automatically available for official royal use. The revised paperwork carried no direct royal signature. Instead, it suggested that a palace official had interpreted broad conversations and general authority as permission to push the reclassification much further than anyone had openly approved. Anne did not celebrate. Vindication suddenly felt too simple. She asked to see William alone and told him that stopping Camilla could not be the final answer. The deeper failure was the system that had allowed assumption to become action. Camilla had lost access, but Anne now understood the real battle was no longer about one queen or one collection. William had to decide what preservation actually meant, and whether locking Elizabeth's jewels away was enough to protect what she intended. After the confrontation, the signatures, and the anger, William and Anne finally sat together without officials, advisors, or titles standing between them. The argument had begun over who could use Elizabeth's jewelry, but Anne no longer wanted to discuss Camilla. She wanted to discuss her mother. For the first time, William understood that the collection could not be protected merely by locking it away. It needed a principle strong enough to survive every reign that came after Elizabeth's. Anne spoke with a calmness that carried more weight than anger. She reminded William that Elizabeth had always understood the difference between royal function and family inheritance. Royal function meant the official duties and symbols attached to the monarchy, while family inheritance referred to possessions whose meaning came from private relationships rather than public office. The princess knew her mother valued continuity, but she also knew Elizabeth never treated every jewel as interchangeable. Some belonged to history, others belonged to memory. William listened carefully because he now saw the danger of keeping everything frozen forever. William admitted that protection could become paralysis. If every piece remained locked away indefinitely, legitimate royal use would disappear with the confusion they were trying to correct. The prince also confessed that his fear had never been only about Camilla. He had watched a personal memory become an administrative entry, then watched that entry begin turning into policy. Policy, once accepted, could become precedent, a past decision later treated as a model for future action. That possibility frightened him more than any single disputed brooch. Anne finally allowed her own grief to surface. She told William that seeing Elizabeth's possessions reduced to classifications, signatures, and custody notes had made her mother's death feel brutally final. The anger everyone had witnessed was partly the pain of watching private meaning disappear beneath procedure. Then she placed Elizabeth's old catalogue beside him. With no aides present and no institutional language between them, the princess gave him the sentence that changed the direction of the entire dispute. Don't protect the boxes. Protect what she meant. William closed the folder. Together they agreed that every piece would receive a clarified status: private family object, historically protected item, or jewel approved for continuing ceremonial use. A custody framework would be the formal system defining who could safeguard, authorize, and use each category. The future king understood that such rules could stop future assumptions from becoming hidden decisions. Anne then shared something more personal, drawn from a private conversation she had once had with Elizabeth. Her mother had told her that jewels themselves mattered less than knowing when they should, and should not, be worn. That memory settled the argument. William decided the collection would eventually reopen, but only after Charles accepted the new framework, and the senior family acknowledged its boundaries. The lockdown had begun in suspicion. Now it was becoming a principle. But while William and Anne had finally found clarity inside the family, the outside world was already turning their private decision into something far more explosive. By the time the story reached the public, the careful distinctions inside the palace had disappeared. The headline was simpler and far more brutal. William had locked Elizabeth's jewels after Anne uncovered a secret. Newspapers framed it as a royal revolt. Broadcasters debated whether Camilla had been humiliated, and crowds gathered looking for signs of division. Yet one public image captured the mood more powerfully than any commentator could. The gates of Buckingham Palace, surrounded by people holding photographs of Elizabeth. Charles watched the coverage with growing frustration. Palace communications had confirmed that access to the late Queen's collection was under formal review, meaning the status and future use of the jewels were being officially examined before any further decisions could be made. The statement carefully avoided blaming Camilla or anyone else. But the king immediately understood the problem. The public was not debating administrative language. They were debating loyalty, memory, and whether William had been forced to protect his grandmother's legacy from decisions made inside his father's household. Camilla felt that shift just as sharply. One headline described William's action as responsible guardianship. Another presented it as a direct challenge to the reigning king and queen. The queen consort watched her role become reduced to the controversy itself, while the details of what she had actually authorized disappeared beneath public emotion. She knew that even if the review cleared her of deliberately taking Elizabeth's private jewels, the impression could remain. Once the public believed someone had crossed a royal boundary, technical explanations rarely carried the same force as the original accusation. The reaction intensified the next morning. A major newspaper placed a photograph of Elizabeth wearing one disputed piece across its front page, beneath 4 words: her jewels, her wishes. Outside Buckingham Palace, people gathered with flowers, photographs, and handwritten messages, thanking Anne for protecting her mother's legacy. Buckingham Palace is the monarch's principal official London residence, and one of the most powerful public symbols of the crown. That made the gathering impossible to dismiss as ordinary curiosity. It had become an emotional verdict. Anne received confirmation through the palace's documented review that several disputed entries were being restored to their previous classifications. That decision effectively validated the heart of her concern. The records had moved too far beyond Elizabeth's clearly established arrangements. William now knew the lockdown had achieved what he intended, but success brought another danger. The family could not allow the correction to become a permanent weapon against Camilla or Charles. Charles watched footage of the crowd, lowered the remote, and turned to William. His frustration had changed into resolve. He told his son that Elizabeth's memory could not become something the family used against one another. William agreed, but he also made clear that any settlement had to protect what Anne had uncovered. The public had already delivered its emotional judgment. Now Charles had to endorse a final settlement, and the royal family would have to decide whether this crisis ended in humiliation, reconciliation, or a permanent fracture. The collection did not remain locked forever. That was never the true ending. William's decision forced the family to confront something more important than possession: whether Elizabeth's wishes would survive the people interpreting them after her death. When Charles finally gathered William, Anne, and Camilla together, there were no more disputed lists left to examine. The investigation had established what went wrong. What remained was harder, the emotional reckoning, and the decision that would define what happened next. Charles entered that final meeting knowing he could no longer hide behind procedure. The documented review concluded that administrative overreach, not a valid instruction from Elizabeth, had caused several private pieces to be treated as available for broader royal use. Administrative overreach meant officials had gone beyond the authority they were actually given. The king accepted that distinction because it mattered enormously. Nobody had produced a signed instruction showing that his mother wanted those private jewels reassigned. Without that proof, assumption could no longer stand in place of intent. Camilla faced the conclusion without the anger that had defined the earlier confrontation. She acknowledged that her conversations about future ceremonial use had created assumptions she should have challenged more clearly. The queen consort still rejected the idea that she had wanted to erase Elizabeth's wishes, but she accepted that becoming queen did not automatically give her personal claim over every symbol associated with the woman before her. Charles listened carefully, because repairing the damage required accountability without turning the settlement into punishment. Anne did not soften the reason she had intervened. She told the family that silence would have allowed questionable classifications to harden into accepted practice. William supported her, making clear that the lockdown had never been designed to humiliate Camilla. It had been designed to stop uncertainty from becoming precedent. A permanent classification system was then approved, clearly separating Elizabeth's private family jewels from historically protected pieces and items legitimately available for continuing royal duty. That framework finally gave each category a clear purpose and boundary. William waited until Charles signed the new arrangement before lifting the blanket restriction. None of the disputed private pieces would automatically pass into Camilla's personal use. Those identified as Elizabeth's family possessions would remain protected, while approved ceremonial pieces could once again serve the monarchy under the new safeguards. The prince returned the secured access key to official custody. Anne watched him do it, and, for the first time since her discovery, raised no objection. The crisis ended with something stronger than victory. Anne had protected her mother's intentions. William had stopped confusion from becoming tradition. Charles had accepted responsibility for a system that moved beyond what he intended. Camilla had been forced to recognize a boundary that rank alone could not erase. Elizabeth's jewels were unlocked, but the boundary around her legacy had never been stronger, and the family finally understood that preserving the crown sometimes meant refusing to claim what history had never truly given them. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.